Miss Marple and the Murder Beneath the Autumn Leaves. Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back to Warm Chapters. I'm Thomas, and I'm delighted to be with you tonight as the day winds down. Tell us where you're listening from and which season you love most. If you enjoy cozy mysteries, please subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. Chapter 1. Golden Light Over the Village Green. Late October had always possessed a singular gift for making English village life appear kinder than, on close acquaintance, it generally was. In St Mary Mead, as elsewhere, the season laid a flattering hand upon everything. The hard outlines of cottages softened beneath the pale gold of thinning light. The gravel paths seemed more companionable. Even the church tower, severe enough in rain, took on an aspect of ancient benevolence against a washed grey-blue sky. The elm trees bordering the farther edge of the green had, over the previous fortnight, surrendered their leaves, with decorous reluctance. They now lay in drifts of amber, russet, and deep metallic gold beneath the branches, as though autumn had emptied a jeweller's tray there and left it for the village to admire. It was the kind of morning that encouraged the most unreasonable optimism. One might look at such a sky, such trees, such settled peace, and believe for a moment that people too were as orderly as the seasons. Miss Jane Marple, standing at her garden gate with a light shawl about her shoulders, knew perfectly well that this was never the case. She'd come out rather earlier than she needed to, telling herself it was to see whether the late dahlias had survived the night air. But she was honest enough, in her private thoughts, to admit that she had wished simply to look at the green before the day's little bustle began. It was one of those familiar prospects that rewarded long acquaintance. The church stood at the far side, quiet and permanent. The postbox looked stoutly civic. A robin, balanced on its top with a degree of self-importance entirely out of proportion to its size, announced himself as though he, rather than the vicar, had charge of village morals. In a few hours, much of that calm would be absorbed into the annual harvest exhibition. Officially styled the Harvest Exhibition in a series of cream-coloured programmes, the occasion occupied the parish hall for 3 days each late October, and was regarded by St Mary Mead with an earnestness outsiders seldom understood. There were rows of preserves shining in glass jars, root vegetables of frankly excessive ambition, sponge cakes of dependable virtue, needlework varying from admirable to affectionate, and floral arrangements that gave rise each year to more passion than any civilized subject strictly ought. To the uninitiated, it might have appeared a modest country affair. To the village, it was something more exacting. An annual display of competence, taste, order, and continuity. It allowed St. Mary Mead to examine itself, approve the result, and proceed into winter with renewed confidence in its own standards. The leading spirit behind the business was Mr. Lawrence Avery. Mr. Avery, a retired magistrate of 68, belonged unmistakably to that older school of Englishmen who considered authority neither a burden nor an accident, but a natural extension of character. He was tall, spare, and carefully erect, as though posture, like principle, ought never to be relaxed. His hair was silver white and brushed with exactness, his clothes always orderly, his opinions permanently arranged for use. Those who admired him described him as dependable and firm. Those who spoke of him in kitchens and lowered their voices only slightly employed other expressions. He had been a widower for many years and had drifted into that form of self-sufficiency which in some temperaments dries into rigidity. He was the sort of man whom communities often find indispensable and individuals often find exhausting. Miss Marple had known him for a very long time and regarded him with a kind of practical tolerance. He was, she often thought, like some handsome but unyielding piece of furniture, solid, useful, rather cold, and inclined to bruise one if approached carelessly. The exhibition committee over which he presided contained several persons of interest. Mrs. Helena Durrant, who managed most of the practical work, was perhaps 50, slender, dark-haired, and endowed with that smooth, capable efficiency which can so easily be mistaken for serenity. She arranged bookings allocations, programs, and exhibitors, with a quiet mastery that spared others trouble and seldom advertised itself. She was pleasant without being warm, useful without ever appearing hurried. Men of Mr. Avery's sort usually valued such women highly, while remaining happily unaware of how much depended upon them. Her husband, Mr. Philip Durrant, was less easily summarised. Some years younger than his wife, he had the look of a man still wrestling in middle life, with opinions formed in youth. He had recently returned from London after an absence of some months, and had brought back with him a restlessness that had not improved his temper. He spoke more than once of modernisation, innovation, and the need to move beyond village habits which, in his view, had hardened into ritual. Mr. Avery, hearing such remarks, had received them with the frosty patience reserved by elderly magistrates for men they consider both wrong and fashionable. Miss Cora Lyle, who taught at the village school, completed another portion of the social machinery. She was about 40, unmarried, good-natured, and listened to people with such sincere attention that they often left her company imagining themselves far cleverer than they were. Her floral entries at the exhibition were as constant as the church clock, and so, Miss Marple had long suspected, was her admiration for Mr. Avery. It was not of a foolish sort. Indeed, it had endured too long and too quietly to be called foolish, but it existed, and in villages such loyalties are seldom invisible to the right observer. Thomas Bell, the village groundsman and occasional handyman, belonged to that valuable class of men who are everywhere useful and nowhere obtrusive. In his late 50s, broad-handed, weathered, and habitually silent, he tended the green, repaired what required repairing, and moved through the village with the curious invisibility that often attaches itself to those who see much and say little. He knew the trees at the edge of the green as well as some men know relations. Miss Marple herself had no formal role in the exhibition this year. She had declined to exhibit preserves, having found that jam, when judged competitively, revealed more of human nature than was altogether agreeable. Yet she intended to observe the preparations. People were never so interesting, she had always found, as when organising something respectable. There is a particular tension to collective virtue. It strains at the edges. The afternoon of the 24th of October arrived fine and cool, with the washed clarity that follows a morning drizzle. The green had been freshly raked. Thomas Bell's hand showed in the neatness of the work. The elm copse at the eastern edge stood luminous and still, the leaves hardly stirring. At about 3 o'clock Mr. Avery was seen crossing the green toward it. He carried, as was his invariable custom, a small silver-plated flask engraved with his initials. It contained what he referred to, rather pompously, Miss Marple always thought, as a diluted sherry preparation, which he considered beneficial in cool weather. Several villagers noticed him pass. Mrs. Durrant, standing at her gate, lifted a hand. Thomas Bell touched his cap from near the tool shed. Miss Lyle, glancing from the schoolroom window, followed Mr. Avery's progress with an expression that, had Miss Marple seen it, she might have found worth remembering. He remained away longer than usual. It was Thomas Bell who found him shortly before 6:15, when the October light had begun to thicken toward dusk. Mr. Avery sat on the old stone bench beneath the elm, his back against the trunk, his hands folded with an almost ceremonial neatness. The flask lay beside him, empty. At first glance there was something curiously composed in the scene, as though death itself had wished to avoid causing inconvenience, but death, Miss Marple knew, was seldom so considerate. Dr. Haydock, when summoned, examined the body with his usual brisk competence. He had the grave, sensible manner of a man who had attended too many endings to sentimentalise any of them. After some minutes he turned to the little group that had gathered at a respectful distance. "Heart failure," he said. "He has not been well for some time, as some of you know. I should not imagine the strain was large. It appears to have been very sudden." The village received the news with the measured sorrow appropriate to the passing of an important man who had not been, in the warmer sense, loved. Voices lowered, doors shut quietly, windows lit one by one around the green. The autumn evening closed in, clean and cold, smelling faintly of damp leaves and wood smoke. Miss Marple walked home slowly. There were one or two things, she thought, that did not altogether please her. The flask, for one thing, had been empty to the very last drop. Mr. Avery was a man of habit, and habitually moderate. He liked regularity in all things, including indulgence. An entirely drained flask seemed unusual. Then there was Mrs. Durrant's face when the news had been brought to her. Not grief, exactly. Certainly not surprise. It had been the expression of a woman confronted at last with something long anticipated and still not welcome in the form it had chosen to take. And Miss Lyle's tears had had about them an element more tangled than bereavement. There are tears of affection, of shock, of pity, of fear, of remorse. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know they are not interchangeable. At her gate she paused and looked back across the darkening green. The bench itself was lost in the growing dusk, but she knew precisely where it stood beneath the elms. A weak heart and an autumn walk might well explain Mr. Avery's death. But when events lie too smoothly upon the surface, Miss Marple had often found they generally conceal some awkward protrusion underneath. She went indoors, put the kettle on, and sat down to think. Chapter 2. A thermos left on the stone bench. The next morning broke with that deceptive mildness October occasionally assumes, as though apologising in advance for the harsher weather waiting just beyond the hedge. A pale sun filtered through thin cloud, turning the village green almost luminous. The fallen leaves, which Thomas Bell had so carefully gathered the previous day, had already been disturbed again by wind, by some small creature, or perhaps merely by autumn's own untidy instinct, and lay scattered in lazy arcs over the grass. Thomas Bell, arriving with his barrow at 8, surveyed them without emotion. He possessed the stoicism of a man who had spent a lifetime correcting the repeated offences of nature, and no longer expected gratitude. Miss Marple had slept tolerably well. Experience had taught her that the mind often performed its best work in the first moments after waking, while one still lay half within the gentler disorder of dreams. It was during that quiet interval that the events of the previous afternoon had rearranged themselves in her thoughts with increasing distinctness. By breakfast she had reached no conclusion. Miss Marple was too sensible to leap where she could walk, but she had identified several questions. The most insistent of them concerned the flask. It was while considering this over her second cup of tea that Mrs. Bantry appeared at the garden gate. Mrs. Bantry had, over the years, developed an unfailing instinct for village occurrences worth discussing, and a still more refined instinct for identifying the person with whom to discuss them profitably. She entered with sympathetic briskness, and settled herself into the armchair which long habit had rendered, if not legally hers, at least morally occupied. "Poor Mr. Avery," she said, accepting tea, "though one cannot honestly say it was wholly unexpected. Dr. Haydock warned him in the spring, did he not, that he ought to be more careful?" "So I understand," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry adjusted her gloves. "I saw him myself yesterday, very upright, very certain of everything as usual. He stopped me outside the hall to complain that the order in the printed programme was improper. He considered the preserves should appear before the root vegetables. Or perhaps it was the other way around. In any case, he seemed entirely prepared to—" "Survive us all," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "He had very decided views." "He had very decided everything," said Mrs. Bantry with satisfaction. "Still, one is sorry. He gave a good deal of time to the village, whatever one may have thought of the spirit in which it was given." It was a just enough observation. Miss Marple, turning her cup in its saucer, said in her mildest voice, "He always carried that flask, I believe." "Oh, yes, diluted sherry. He was absurdly particular about it. Helena Durrant usually prepared it for him, I think." Miss Marple lifted her eyes. "Did she?" Mrs. Bantry, who knew very well that such a question might or might not be innocent, became more alert. "Yes, so I believe. He trusted very few people to get the proportions right. Helena had a talent for managing him in those small domestic matters. She did the sort of thing efficiently, and he liked efficiency, provided he did not have to acknowledge dependence on it. Miss Marple allowed a silence to fall. Silence, she had found, was often more enlightening than inquiry. People mistrusted questions. They frequently rushed to mend silences. Mrs. Bantry did not mend this one, but presently moved into a disquisition on likely prize-winning cakes, from which Miss Marple gathered little, except that Mrs. Price Ridley's seed loaf remained a threat to village morale. Her own thoughts continued elsewhere. By mid-morning she set out to call upon Mrs. Durrant. The Durrant house, a neat Georgian property on the farther side of the green, possessed the same air of controlled competence as its mistress. The front garden was in excellent order. The brass knocker shone. The curtains hung with unobtrusive precision. The door opened almost before Miss Marple had reached the step, suggesting that Helena Durrant had seen her coming, and had decided, sensibly enough, that waiting would look worse than readiness. "Miss Marple," she said with warm civility, "how kind of you! Do come in." The sitting-room was immaculate, but its order had about it a note of effort. A vase of chrysanthemums stood on the mantelpiece, too carefully arranged to be entirely natural. The cushions were aligned with the kind of precision that usually indicated recent adjustment. Some mornings yield to tidiness, others are subdued by it. Mrs. Durrant sat opposite her visitor, hands folded in her lap, her face composed in an expression of quiet and entirely suitable sadness. "It has been a dreadful shock," she said. "Though Dr. Haydock is quite certain the heart simply failed, he had been much more fragile than he ever admitted." "He was not perhaps a man who admitted weakness easily," said Miss Marple. "No." The single syllable was spoken very softly. Miss Marple let a moment pass, then said, "I understand you prepared the flask for him yesterday." Something changed. Very little, but unmistakably. It was not panic. Helena Durrant was not a woman who panicked. It was rather the minute inward readjustment of someone who had expected a door to remain closed and hears the handle turn. "Yes," she said, "I did. He always liked it done in a particular way. I keep a small bottle of the sherry he preferred. Philip never drinks it." She paused, then added, with the careful smoothness of one who has chosen to offer more rather than seem to withhold it, "I prepared it in the kitchen and left it on the dresser for him to collect when he called at 2. "And he collected it himself?" "He did. I was in the garden. Philip answered the door first, I believe, but Mr. Avery came through to the kitchen and took the flask exactly as he always did." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Mr. Durrant was at home then?" "For most of the afternoon, yes. He went out later, just for a walk. He has been restless since coming back from London." Again the tone was neutral, but Miss Marple noticed that Helena Durrant's accuracy was of an almost defensive kind. She was not merely describing events, she was setting them in order. At that moment Philip Durrant appeared in the doorway. He entered with the constrained air of a man who's been listening outside and has decided, rather late, that to continue doing so would be more conspicuous than joining the conversation. He looked tired, ill at ease, and faintly irritated by his own discomfort. "Miss Marple," he said. He sat down without quite waiting to be asked. His eyes went first to his wife. The glance was brief but full of meaning. Concern, caution, perhaps complicity, though Miss Marple did not yet care to define it too precisely. "I was saying," said Mrs. Durrant, not looking at him, "that Mr. Avery collected the flask himself." "Yes," said Philip quickly, too quickly. "I saw him at the door. He seemed perfectly well, even cheerful in his way. Said something about the exhibition being the proper sort of occasion to remind the village what standards meant." His mouth hardened a little. "Something of that sort, anyway." "You parted on good terms?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. Philip looked at her as men do when they suspect that something harmless has just been made dangerous. "We were never intimate, Miss Marple," he said. "We disagreed about a good many things, but no, there was no quarrel yesterday. Not if that is what you are suggesting." Miss Marple smiled with mild apology. "Oh, I was suggesting nothing. That, she knew, was one of the least reassuring replies in the English language. She remained another quarter of an hour and talked of entirely safe matters: the exhibition tables, the weather's effect on cut flowers, the difficulty of keeping chrysanthemums fresh once the first hard frost arrived. Helena answered every topic with composure. Philip spoke very little. He sat with his forearms on his knees and stared at the rug as though it contained an argument he had not yet won. Walking home across the gravel path, Miss Marple considered both what she had learned and what had been withheld. She had learned that Helena Durrant had prepared the flask in her kitchen some hours before Mr. Avery's walk. She had learned that the flask had stood unattended on the dresser. She had learned that Philip Durrant was in the house at the relevant time and had gone out shortly after Mr. Avery left. She had learned, too, that husband and wife were carrying between them some unspoken understanding which each expected the other to preserve. What she had not learned was in some ways more valuable. She had not learned why Helena's composure, so faultlessly maintained in every other respect, had shifted ever so slightly at the mention of the flask. Nor had she learned why Philip's account, though superficially plausible, bore the faint but unmistakable quality of rehearsal, as though he had already repeated it once or twice to himself before delivering it aloud. At her own gate, Miss Marple stopped and looked toward the elm copse at the far edge of the green. The stone bench was visible now in the pale morning light, empty and innocent. A single leaf detached itself overhead and drifted down with lazy grace. There was, she thought, something profoundly misleading about objects left in their natural settings. A flask on a kitchen dresser, a flask on a stone bench, a man seated quietly under a tree. Each could seem perfectly ordinary. Yet the difference between the natural and the arranged was often the whole difference between accident and intention. Miss Marple went indoors to decide whom she ought to speak to next. Chapter 3. The Harvest Programme on Cream-Coloured Card. The exhibition opened on the morning of the 26th, as it always did, with that quiet exactitude which in English village life frequently serves in place of grandeur and is, in its own way, every bit as ceremonial. Thomas Bell had unlocked the parish hall at 7 o'clock and arranged the trestle tables the previous evening with his customary efficiency. He now moved among them carrying a damp cloth, passing it over surfaces already perfectly clean, with the grave attention of a man to whom usefulness had become not merely a habit, but a kind of private discipline. By 9 the exhibitors had begun to arrive. They came bearing jars, cakes, marrows, embroidered cushions, floral pieces, and the various other proofs by which a village periodically asserts its standards to itself. Entries were placed, adjusted, shifted half an inch to the left, returned to their original positions, and then accepted with the expression of people pretending not to care very much about outcomes in which they were in fact deeply invested. Afterwards they retired in little groups to the side room for tea and those civil exchanges which, under a remarkably thin social varnish, concealed emotions of a distinctly competitive nature. Miss Marple had not intended to arrive early. At least she had not consciously intended to do so. Her original plan had been to attend rather later in the morning, once the opening formalities were concluded and the village had settled into the more revealing phase that follows public effort, the phase in which self-consciousness relaxes and natural behaviour begins. Yet at 9 o'clock she found herself putting on her good coat, selecting her most sensible shoes, and crossing the green with the unhurried purpose of a woman who has remembered something she would like to look at before anyone quite notices that she is looking. A neat stack of cream-coloured programmes had been arranged near the hall door, and Miss Marple took one before moving to a chair in the corner by the preserves table, where she might read without appearing to study anything more significant than the printed order of the day. It was a modest document, but a carefully considered one. 4 pages, folded once, dark ink, card of a quality slightly superior to necessity. It reflected very exactly Mr. Avery's view that the exhibition was the village presented at its most orderly, and ought therefore to present itself accordingly. The front page bore the year, the dates, and the familiar heading. the annual St. Mary Mead Harvest exhibition, printed in the same typeface that had been used for so many years that no one any longer thought of it as a design choice at all, but rather as part of the exhibition's natural order, like marrows or prize cards or the smell of polish and damp wool in the hall. Inside were listed the contributors by category, with the judges' names beneath each section in smaller type, and at the back a brief note thanking those who had given their time to the event's organisation. Miss Marple read the programme with the quiet attention she brought to all printed matter. Printed things, she had always thought, were peculiarly revealing. Speech could be careless, emotional, improvised, or misleading even to the speaker. Print had a different quality. What a person or committee chose to fix in ink usually betrayed, in some subtle way, what they considered important enough to preserve, and equally what they considered safe to omit. The floral arrangement section occupied half a column on the second page. She read the list once, then again. The names were in alphabetical order, 4 in number. Miss Coralile's name was not among them. Miss Marple did not move at once. She merely folded the programme carefully along its original crease, and rested it upon her knee. She was still sitting there when Miss Lyle herself came in through the side door, carrying a flat wicker basket containing a pair of cotton gloves and a small notebook of the sort school teachers often seem to possess in endless supply. She was neatly dressed, as always, in a brown wool coat that suited her fair colouring and gave her an air of modest competence. There was about Miss Lyle that quality Miss Marple had observed in certain women of quiet usefulness, a manner which suggested that they had long since learned the safest way to move through life was to make themselves indispensable, and to ask for very little. She saw Miss Marple and smiled. It was a real smile, but one that seemed to require a small perceptible effort before it reached completion. "Miss Marple," she said, "I did not expect to see you quite so early." "I might say the same of you, my dear," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Do sit down for a moment. I think there is still tea in the side room if you want some later." Miss Lyle set down her basket and took the chair beside her. For a little while they sat in companionable silence, the kind possible only between people who have known one another long enough not to fear it. At the far end of the hall someone was rearranging root vegetables with unnecessary care. A spoon rattled against a teacup in the side room. There was an air of organised anticipation everywhere, but beneath it Miss Marple sensed, as one sometimes does before a change in weather, a pressure not wholly explained by the day's business. "You're not exhibiting this year," she said at last, leaving the remark open. Miss Lyle's glance moved very briefly to the programme on Miss Marple's lap. "No," she said. "Mr. Avery felt the section would benefit from a different approach this year. More architectural arrangements, he said. Less cottage garden." She gave the faintest little pause before adding, "I did not argue. There would not have been much point." "No," said Miss Marple softly, "I dare say not. There are many ways in which authority may express itself. One of the commonest is not to forbid a thing directly, but to state so clearly what ought to happen that disagreement begins to look like bad taste." Mr. Avery, Miss Marple thought, had always possessed that particular skill in abundance. He was not unkind about it, Miss Lyle continued after a moment, and spoke with the scrupulous fairness of a woman determined not to wrong even someone who had disappointed her. "He said my arrangements had real charm, and that charm was not what the section required this year." A faint colour had risen in her face. "That," she said, "is a very civil way of saying what he meant." "And what did he mean?" Miss Lyle looked down at her folded hands. "That I was not sophisticated enough. That my work was pleasant rather than impressive." She raised her eyes again, and in them Miss Marple saw something smoothed by long practice but not altogether blunted. Hurt, certainly, but not fresh hurt. Hurt that had been met before and incorporated into the structure of one's thinking. "He said something very similar 3 years ago about the needlework I submitted. On that occasion he may have been right. I am not sure he was right this time." Then, after the tiniest pause, "But it is not a distinction that matters very much. Now." The sentence carried more weight than its words alone accounted for, but Miss Marple did not press it. "You spoke with him the morning before he died," she said instead, and made it a statement rather than a question. Miss Lyle steadied herself almost imperceptibly. "Yes, briefly. He was standing at the gate of the hall with Mrs. Durrant going over the programme. I stopped to ask whether anything further was needed before opening." She hesitated. "He said the standard of entries this year was, on the whole, more satisfactory than last." The phrasing was exact, and for that reason more revealing than any paraphrase would have been. "He also said," Miss Lyle went on, "that he intended to refer publicly to the omission of certain traditional elements from the exhibition's programme. He did not explain himself, but his tone suggested he meant to do so with some emphasis." Miss Marple found that distinctly interesting. And how did Mrs. Durrant receive that? Miss Lyle's expression sharpened slightly, as though memory had suddenly focused. "She smiled," she said, "very pleasantly, and she replied that she was certain the exhibition would reflect the higher standards as it always did." "And Mr. Avery?" He nodded as though she had entirely agreed with him. Miss Lyle allowed herself the ghost of a dry smile. I was not sure that she had. There was a brief silence between them. From somewhere across the hall came the dull wooden sound of a chair being moved. The air smelled of floor polish, tea, damp leaves carried in on shoes and chrysanthemums. "He was in sharp spirits that morning," Miss Lyle said quietly. "Sharper than usual, perhaps. He made one or two remarks, not specifically about the exhibition, but about standards slipping generally. It seemed to me that he was preparing himself for some kind of correction. A public remark, a letter, something declaratory. He was like that when he had decided. A thing must be set right. One could feel it in him." Miss Marple nodded, rather like the pressure in the air before a thunderstorm. Miss Lyle turned and looked at her with a little start of recognition. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." After another minute she rose, gathered her basket, and said she ought to see whether the programme table required attention. She moved away with the quiet efficiency that characterised everything she did, never wasting a gesture, never calling attention to herself, and yet leaving behind her an impression not of insignificance but of careful endurance. Miss Marple remained in her chair for a few moments longer, thinking. She was reminded of a woman she'd once known in the village years ago, a capable, patient creature who had spent the greater part of her life attending upon an exacting elderly aunt. The aunt had not been openly tyrannical. Open tyranny often produces rebellion. She had been rather unrelenting in a quieter way, always certain, always correct, always faintly disapproving when preferences other than her own were displayed. The younger woman had once confided to Miss Marple, in an unusually candid moment, that the most exhausting aspect of such an arrangement was not the labour itself, but the gradual erosion of one's own confidence. One began by making accommodations. One ended by feeling that one's own judgments were somehow less trustworthy than those of the dominant person, and that leaving the arrangement, even inwardly, required a courage one no longer felt sure one possessed. When the aunt died, quite naturally, and after a sufficiently respectable illness, the younger woman had not been relieved so much as hollowed out. The framework that had organised her days had vanished, and she did not know at once what shape remained to her. Miss Lyle, Miss Marple thought, was in something of the same position, not dependent in any obvious material sense, of course, but dependent in that subtler and far more pervasive way that arises when one's idea of one's self has, over time, been partly formed by the judgments of someone stronger, more assured and habitually authoritative. To be disappointed by such a man was natural. To feel resentment now and then was equally natural. Miss Marple thought no worse of Miss Lyle for either emotion. Whether emotion of that sort had gone any further than disappointment remained, for the present, an open question. Her eyes dropped again to the programme in her hand. The cream card was of very good quality, smooth, thick, designed to suggest seriousness and permanence. The list in the floral section was neat, final, and complete. 4 names where there had usually been 5. The omission was perfectly invisible unless one happened to know it ought not to be. How often, Miss Marple reflected, the most painful things in village life were not what appeared, but what failed to appear. The exhibition would proceed, as such events always do, with its usual mixture of genuine local pride, social choreography, mild hypocrisy, honest effort, and that specific tension produced whenever people who know one another very well are placed in organised competition under the supervision of shared standards. Mr. Avery was gone, but the standards remained, printed in dark ink upon cream card, tangible and authoritative, surviving the man who had so long enforced them. Miss Marple rose at last. As she did so, she noticed Philip Durrant standing near the far window. He had evidently entered while she was speaking with Miss Lyle, and was reading a copy of the programme with an expression too distant to be easily deciphered from where she stood. He held the card in both hands, and his thumbs pressed rather hard against its edges, as though some internal strain had travelled outward and sought relief in the fingers. After a moment he folded it, not along the original crease. Then he put it into his coat pocket. It was a very small thing, and he had not the least idea he had been observed. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime discovering how very much may hide inside very small things, found it worth remembering. She collected her gloves, nodded pleasantly to Thomas Bell near the door, and stepped out into the brightening October morning. Chapter 4. Soft applause in the Parish Hall. The formal opening of the harvest exhibition was fixed for 11 o'clock, which allowed the village just enough time to complete its morning errands, alter into something appropriate, and arrive with the comfortable pretence that no special preparation had been required at all. By a quarter to the hour, the Parish Hall had filled to a degree best described as comfortably complete. The folding chairs set out before the small raised platform at the northern end were occupied by that characteristic village mixture of the willing, the curious, and the dutifully present. There was the usual pleasant hum of low conversation, of programmes being folded and unfolded, of neighbours greeting one another in tones carefully pitched between intimacy and public decorum. The atmosphere was sociable without yet becoming noisy, which in itself was a creditable achievement for St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had chosen a seat near the middle of the second row. It was, she had long since found, one of the most informative positions in any room. The front limited one's view of other people, while the back offered chiefly the backs of heads, which, though not wholly without value, were generally less expressive than faces. From the middle one might see both the platform and, by the merest inclination of the head, the greater part of the audience as well. This year, of course, the ceremony could not proceed in quite its usual form. For the past 11 years, Mr. Avery had opened the exhibition with a short address, delivered in his own firm, judicial manner. He would review the categories, offer some measured remark on standards, and conclude with a phrase so regularly employed that it had become part of the ritual itself. There was comfort in repetition. Villages often depend upon it more than they admit. Now that sequence had been interrupted, and there was for a brief time an uncertainty in the room, not dramatic but perceptible, about how such an absence ought to be managed. It was Mrs. Durrant who resolved it, as she appeared to resolve most practical difficulties, with quiet efficiency and no trace of self-advertisement. She had arranged for the Reverend Mr. Clemens to say a few words first in memory of Mr. Avery, and he rose now to do so with the practised warmth of a clergyman who understood the peculiar demands of speaking kindly of the recently dead, when the dead have been more respected than loved. He spoke of long service, of civic devotion, of exact standards, of commitment to the village and its traditions. He referred also to Mr. Avery's genuine affection for St. Mary Mead, which was received by the audience with that particular stillness people adopt in church, adjacent contexts when confronted with a sentiment they have no wish openly to dispute, but do not feel obliged to affirm too enthusiastically either. Miss Marple listened attentively, though not primarily to the Reverend. People are seldom more revealing than during moments of officially observed feeling. One is asked, as it were, to feel something suitable, and the very effort of suitability often betrays what lies underneath. Mrs. Durrant sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed and appropriately grave. The emotion there was real enough, Miss Marple thought, but not easily named. It was not grief in any simple form. It had more the air of a woman who had reached the end of something long, demanding and complicated, and who had not yet disentangled relief from fatigue. Philip Durrant, beside her, looked at no one in particular. He gazed toward the middle distance, with that withdrawn, slightly over-controlled expression, which often indicates a mind occupied elsewhere. He had the appearance of a man who had slept badly and resented both the fact and the reasons for it. Miss Lyle sat 3 seats away from Miss Marple in the same row, her programme folded between her hands, her eyes lowered. If she was mastering any strong feeling, she was doing so privately enough that its exact nature could not be read. There was in her stillness something almost scholastic, as though she had decided the correct thing now was composure, and meant, whatever the internal cost, to provide it. Thomas Bell had placed himself near the rear door. He stood, as men like Thomas Bell stand at public occasions, both present and unobtrusive, available if needed, nearly invisible if not. Yet Miss Marple noticed that his attention was fixed rather more sharply upon the front of the room than mere duty required. He was not simply waiting for the ceremony to end. He was, in some quiet way, observing. The Reverend concluded by saying that the best memorial to a man such as Mr. Avery was to carry forward the things he had valued. He invited the company to a brief moment of reflection. The silence that followed was perfectly proper. Then came applause. It was adequate. That, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the most truthful tribute available. It was not the awkward silence of a room with nothing good to say, nor was it the warm, instinctive response that follows mention of a beloved figure. It occupied the decent interval between those two extremes with precision and restraint. If collective feeling could ever be measured accurately, she suspected this would have done it. Mrs. Durrant then rose to open the exhibition in her capacity as chair. She did so briefly and very well. She thanked the exhibitors and judges, observed that the standard of entries was gratifyingly high, and invited everyone to enjoy the day with a phrase less formal and considerably more human than any Mr. Avery had ever employed. The applause on this occasion was noticeably warmer. That, too, told its own story. Mrs. Durrant accepted it with a slight inclination of the head, and a small, controlled smile that contained no discernible satisfaction. Miss Marple noticed that. Many women would have allowed themselves, however fleetingly, a hint of triumph in succeeding, where a more overbearing predecessor had long dominated. Helena Durrant did not. Either she possessed remarkable discipline, or she did not view the present arrangement as a victory, possibly both. When the company began to disperse about the hall to inspect the exhibits, Miss Marple made her way gradually toward the rear, where Thomas Bell had begun folding and stacking the chairs from the outer rows with the methodical steadiness of a man who took serious pleasure in things being done properly. "A sad occasion," she said, coming to stand beside him with the air of one who had merely drifted there. "Yes, Miss Marple," said Thomas Bell. He lifted 2 chairs together and set them against the wall. "You have been groundsman here a long time," Miss Marple observed. "You must have seen a great deal of Mr. Avery's involvement over the years." Thomas straightened slowly. He was not a man who spoke quickly. Miss Marple, who respected people of considered speech, waited without helping him toward an answer. Silence, when properly used, often gives better results than encouragement. "He had strong opinions," Thomas said at last. The sentence was delivered with admirable neutrality, but Miss Marple was not deceived by it. Neutrality itself is often a judgment, particularly when more favourable words are available and not chosen. "Yes," she said mildly. "He knew what he thought things ought to be," Thomas went on, "and he was fairly fixed about it. That can be useful, up to a point." "And beyond that point?" Thomas looked at her with the mild, cautious expression of a man reconsidering how much he wished to say. "Past that point," he replied. "It can make things difficult for those who have to go on living alongside the opinions." There was a little pause. Then, with the air of a man who has decided that honesty is on the whole preferable to excessive caution, he added, "I overheard something the afternoon before he died, near the tool shed. I don't know whether it matters." Miss Marple's face did not alter. "Tell me." Mr. Philip Durrant and Mr. Avery were having words, or rather, Mr. Durrant was having them, and Mr. Avery was receiving them. Thomas set another pair of chairs against the wall before continuing. Mr. Durrant had some sort of paper in his hand. A notice, maybe. Something about changing part of the exhibition. Judging arrangements, perhaps. Or one of the categories. I couldn't see properly. He frowned slightly, not from uncertainty but from the effort of exact recollection. Mr. Avery listened for a bit, then said the exhibition did not require improvement, only proper stewardship, and that enthusiasm without judgment was of limited value. Miss Marple thought that sounded very like Mr. Avery indeed. And Mr. Durrant? He did not take it quietly. Thomas's tone remained even. He said something I couldn't hear. His voice had dropped. Then I heard Mr. Avery say, quite clearly, "I think we understand each other, Philip." Thomas's hands rested briefly on the backs of the chairs. "It was the way he said it," he added, "the sort of way where the words mean less than the manner." "Oh? Yes," as if the understanding in question was not a comfortable one. "And then?" "Mr. Durrant walked off by the far gate." Thomas considered for a moment. He was unsettled. That would be the word. Miss Marple thanked him with genuine warmth. Thomas Bell was one of those valuable witnesses who observed from habit rather than curiosity and remembered because accuracy mattered to them, not because they enjoyed importance. Such people are often underestimated by everyone except the very occasional person who knows better. She moved away along the side of the hall, pausing from time to time to look at the exhibits with sincere attention. Their merits were real, and Miss Marple never believed that a mystery excused one from proper appreciation of good marmalade or unusually successful chrysanthemums. Near the preserves table she encountered Mrs. Bantry once more, examining a jar of damson jelly with the air of a connoisseur confronted by a notable vintage. "Mabel Hennessy's," Mrs. Bantry said at once, tipping the jar slightly toward the light. "You can always tell by the depth of colour. She does something with the sugar that no one has ever managed to imitate, though several have tried, and one or two have even had the cheek to ask her how she does it." She set the jar down. "How are you finding? How are it all, Jane?" "Very instructive," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry, who knew her old friend well, interpreted this correctly as meaning considerably more than it appeared to. "Philip Durrant looks dreadful," she said, lowering her voice. "Have you noticed? I do not mean grief-stricken. I mean the look of someone who has had too much to think about and much too little sleep." "I have noticed," said Miss Marple. "He and Mr. Avery were not on comfortable terms. One heard things." "One did," said Miss Marple, "though I think the nature of the discomfort may have been rather more particular than people realise." Mrs. Bantry gave her the look she reserved for moments when she suspected Jane Marple was ahead of everyone else by a distance impossible yet to calculate. "Well," she said at last, "I only hope the judging goes smoothly. It seems the least the day can offer." Miss Marple agreed that it did. By the time she left the hall an hour later, the pale October sun had shifted enough to cast long shadows from the elms over the farther edge of the green. The stone bench near the copse stood in full light, empty now and wholly impassive, holding the afternoon with that peculiar indifference which belongs to old stone. Stone, Miss Marple reflected, is an admirable witness in one sense and a useless one in another. It retains everything and tells nothing. She paused on the path and looked at it for a moment. A man had argued sharply near the tool shed and then walked away unsettled. A flask had stood upon a kitchen dresser for several hours. A cream-coloured programme had been folded against its proper crease and pushed into a coat pocket. Applause had been decent, but no more than decent. Small things, all of them. Yet small things, once set in their proper relation to one another, have a habit of becoming considerably larger. Miss Marple turned toward home and walked back through the elm shadows, thinking very carefully indeed. Chapter 5. a leaflet with a torn corner. The second day of the exhibition brought with it a change in the weather of the modest but unmistakable sort that the residents of St Mary Mead had long ago learned to interpret with nearly agricultural accuracy. The sky had lowered in the night, and by breakfast time a thin, persistent drizzle had settled over the village with the air of something prepared to remain where it was. The green had darkened. The fallen leaves lay pressed flat and shining against the grass. The elm copse at the far edge looked less like part of a cheerful village prospect than a pencil drawing, not yet granted the mercy of colour. Miss Marple spent the morning indoors with her knitting and her thoughts. She had always considered that there was, in any matter of complexity, a point at which activity became less profitable than reflection. Once one had gathered a sufficient number of small facts, it was often wiser to stop stirring the surface and allow the deeper currents to make themselves felt. The hands, if occupied in a sensible repetitive task, gave the mind a surprising amount of freedom. Many truths, she thought, came not while one pursued them energetically, but while one quietly left a space into which they might step. She had worked her way to approximately the 3rd inch of a sea-green cardigan, intended for a great niece of uncertain gratitude, when she heard through the sitting-room window, which she kept slightly open in nearly all weathers, the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. They were brisk, faintly uneven, and entirely recognisable. A few moments later, Dr. Haydock was shown in. He removed his hat with the economical movement of a man accustomed to entering houses where his arrival might signify either reassurance or trouble, and sat down where Miss Marple indicated. He was a large, comfortable-looking man of 62, with a face that had spent so many years arranging itself into expressions of practical calm that these had gradually become its ordinary condition. Miss Marple had long considered him one of the cleverest men in the village, and one of the most judicious in his use of cleverness, which, in her opinion, was the far rarer virtue. "Miss Marple," he said, declining a biscuit with the practised certainty of a man who knew that accepting one would lead to 3. "I find I need to speak to someone, and you are, as always, the most reliable candidate." "I am very glad to be of whatever service I can," said Miss Marple, and resumed her knitting. She had found that people often spoke more freely when one continued quietly with one's hands, instead of fixing them with attentive stillness. "The flask," said Dr. Haydock without preamble. "Yes," said Miss Marple. He regarded her for a moment with the faintly disconcerted expression of a man who had expected to have to approach the subject by degrees, and found the direct road already open. The analysis came through this morning. There was a sedative compound present, a mild one, perfectly ordinary in itself, the sort of thing prescribed for sleeplessness in elderly patients. The dose was not large. In a person in good health it would have produced nothing worse than drowsiness, perhaps a heavy sleep. But Avery was not in good health. His heart had not been sound for some time, as I warned him last April, to very limited effect. He paused, looking down at the brim of his hat. "I cannot honestly attribute the death solely to natural causes," he said at last. "Nor can I say with certainty that the sedative caused it. The heart might have failed in any case. But I also cannot in conscience declare the matter unconnected." He looked up again, and there was now in his face the particular discomfort of a conscientious man caught between evidence and conclusion. "I am in a very awkward position." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "It is a particularly trying kind of awkwardness, something too substantial to ignore, and not yet substantial enough to handle with confidence." "Exactly." He settled back a little. "I thought I should tell you, not because I expect you to do anything official. I must decide for myself what official action is required, but because you have, on previous occasions, had a way of illuminating matters so that one sees them more clearly afterwards," he added with the faintest trace of dry humour, "though I would prefer, for the sake of professional dignity, not to put it quite like that in public." Miss Marple smiled. "The compound," she said, "would it dissolve easily?" "Yes, readily in liquid. In diluted sherry, for instance, I doubt one would notice it at all, provided the mixture were otherwise correct. and the amount available in a standard prescription would be more than enough to account for what was found. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain making its quiet presence known against the window pane. Miss Marple knitted 3 stitches with great neatness. "Thank you," she said. "That is very useful." Then, after the smallest pause, "You should know that at least one person in the village keeps such a prescription." Dr. Haydock inclined his head once. He did not confirm it aloud. He did not need to. He remained for a short while longer, speaking of less serious things with the easy compartmentalization of a man used to carrying the grave and the ordinary side by side, and then took his leave. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat for some time without moving, the cardigan wool resting in her lap, and her eyes fixed upon the middle distance. The truth, she thought, had altered shape. Not wholly, not yet decisively, but enough to require a different cast of mind. It was on the following morning, the 3rd and final day of the exhibition, that the handbill came to her attention. Not by her own discovery, of course, but through Mrs. Bantry, who arrived shortly after breakfast, with the air of a woman in possession of information and entirely alive to the social value of conveying it properly. "Thomas Bell found it near the copse," she announced, seating herself and accepting tea with an air of merited entitlement. "Yesterday afternoon, apparently, though he only mentioned it this morning to young Clarence at the post office, who told Edith, who told me. A handbill of some sort, printed or partly printed with writing on it, folded and torn across one corner, found near the stone bench, or close to it." She paused just long enough to enjoy the effect. "Clarence says it was in Philip Durrant's handwriting." "Clarence's mother does the Durrants' forwarding," said Miss Marple calmly, "and Philip has a very distinctive hand, rather emphatic." Mrs. Bantry looked gratified by this useful reinforcement. "The question," she said, "is what it was doing there." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that is very much the question." She did not wait for chance to answer it. That afternoon, in a brief interval between showers, she put on her coat and walked to the Durrants' house, carrying a pot of apple preserve she had genuinely intended to deliver for some days, and which now had the additional advantage of furnishing an entirely natural pretext. She found Philip Durrant alone. The maid informed her that Mrs. Durrant had gone to the hall to assist with the closing arrangements. Philip emerged from the study with the expression of a man who had been sitting in private doing very little, and had not yet decided whether a visitor represented rescue or difficulty. At closer quarters he looked tired, more than tired. There was about him a certain slackening of internal vigilance, as though the effort of maintaining a careful front before the village had become, in private, too exhausting to sustain at full tension. Miss Marple thanked him for receiving her, admired a watercolour over the mantelpiece that genuinely deserved admiration, and settled herself on the sofa with the composed purpose of a woman making an ordinary call. Philip sat opposite. The silence lasted just long enough to become the kind in which people sometimes say what they had not intended to say. "I understand," said Miss Marple at last, in the tone of one mentioning a matter already too general to require ceremony, "that a document of some sort was found near the copse. Something in your hand, I believe." Philip looked at her steadily. The expression that came into his face was, Miss Marple thought, more honest than the one he had lately been offering the village, and also more sympathetic. There was less self-assertion in it, more strain, certainly, but also more plain humanity. "A draft handbill," he said. "I had been preparing proposals for the committee, changes to the exhibition's format, a broader section for younger contributors, separate categories for some of the craft work, updated judging criteria. Nothing revolutionary," he gave the faintest of mirthless smiles. "It felt revolutionary to Avery, I expect." "You had it with you the afternoon he died?" "Yes," he hesitated. "I went out to walk. I thought I might find him at the copse. He had a habit of going there late in the afternoon, and I wanted to speak to him when Helena wasn't present. I thought it might go better without an audience." His expression shifted. Memory, Miss Marple thought, was not treating him kindly. "But I didn't find him as I expected. By the time I reached the copse," he stopped. "He was already there, already dead as Thomas found him later. His jaw tightened. I left. I didn't call anyone. I went home by the lane because I didn't know what to do, and because I was more shaken than I had any simple reason to be, I suppose. The handbill must have fallen, or I dropped it near the path. I only realised later. Then he looked at her directly, with the strained, slightly desperate candour of a man who has needed to tell the truth for several days and has not known where to begin. I did not harm him, Miss Marple. Whatever you may think of our disagreement, I did not harm him. Miss Marple regarded him with quiet attention. She had seen a good many people telling lies in her life, and rather more people telling a version of the truth mixed with what they wished were true. Philip Durrant, she thought, was not doing either of those things. His distress appeared genuine. His guilt, such as it was, belonged to a man who had quarrelled with someone who then died, and who now found himself burdened with the unfinished and unfinishable nature of that quarrel. But remorse of that kind, she reminded herself, was not the only thing that could produce such a face. She thanked him for speaking frankly, finished her tea, and took her leave. Outside, the drizzle had begun again in earnest. She walked home slowly, the apple preserve jar gone from her, Hand and Philip's account occupying its place in her thoughts. She turned the conversation over as she went, considering it from several angles, and found that it did not contradict what she had already begun to suspect, nor did it, as yet, prove it. But she was, she thought, beginning to understand the outline of the thing. The outline was not at all the one she would have guessed at the start, which is often the way with such matters. The visible shape and the true shape of an event are rarely identical. The difference between them is generally where the truth resides. She opened her umbrella and went on through the wet October afternoon. Chapter 6. Conversations near the orchard gate. The exhibition concluded on the afternoon of the 28th with the awarding of its modest honours. Dark red rosettes pinned to winning entries by Mrs. Durrant, with the same composed competence she brought to all executive duties, and a considerable quantity of tea and fruitcake consumed in the side room, where the atmosphere softened noticeably once the competitive strain had been formally brought to an end. The winners received distinction with proper modesty. The unsuccessful displayed graciousness which, in most cases, required only a small effort to sustain. Thomas Bell folded the trestle tables, stacked the chairs, locked the hall at 6 o'clock, and the harvest exhibition of that year came to its subdued and faintly melancholy close. Miss Marple had attended the final afternoon and eaten a slice of fruitcake she considered decidedly over-liberal with the peel, though she had, of course, said nothing to that effect. She had spent much of her time in the side room speaking with various members of the village, which from her perspective was a more profitable use of the occasion than the close examination of prize-winning marrows, however noble their proportions. By the time she walked home across the darkening green, she had acquired 3 pieces of information not in her possession that morning, and was considering them with the careful pleasure of someone sorting through odds and ends found at the back of a drawer, and suspecting that at least one of them will prove unexpectedly important. The first was that Helena Durrant's position as chair of the exhibition committee had not always been so unchallenged as it now appeared. 2 years earlier there had been a quiet but determined effort by another committee member to suggest a rotation of the chairmanship, an effort Mr. Avery had suppressed with such decisive firmness that it had not been raised again. Some believed he had done so out of sincere admiration for Mrs. Durrant's ability. One person in particular, Mrs. Fellows, a retired schoolmistress who was both reliable and inclined to useful length, was of the view that he had done so because Helena's chairmanship allowed his own influence to continue at one remove, which suited him admirably. The second was that Philip Durrant's London business, the nature of which had been the subject of discreet speculation, concerned an enterprise of some financial ambition that had not prospered as fully as had been hoped. He had returned to St. Mary Mead not ruined, precisely, but reduced from the position he had expected to occupy. There are few things the English discuss more delicately, Miss Marple thought, than money, unless it is other people's money in distress. The third piece of information was the most suggestive of all. that the Durrants standing in the village had, at a particular point some years earlier, depended materially upon a word from Mr. Avery, and that the word had been given. Miss Marple had not yet discovered the precise circumstances of that intervention. She spent the next morning, Friday the 29th, in the garden. The sky had cleared. A bright sharpness had returned to the air, and she was attending to the last of the rose beds with the systematic thoroughness she brought to all, gardening. At the same time, in the background of her mind, the three newly acquired facts were arranging themselves in relation to one another. It was while thus employed, kneeling on her gardening mat by the far bed, that she heard voices in the lane beyond the orchard wall. The wall was old stone, well kept, and not especially high. Sound carried over it with remarkable fidelity, a property Miss Marple had observed before without ever making a habit of exploiting it. She did not move closer now. She merely continued her work and listened. The voices were Helena Durrant's, and after a moment she thought, Miss Lyle's. They were not quarrelling. Their tones were low and careful. But there was about both of them the particular quality of people selecting their words with precision, which Miss Marple had always considered more revealing than freedom. Mrs. Durrant was speaking. "I am not suggesting that you owe an explanation to anyone, Cora, only that it might be kinder, in the circumstances, not to raise it at this particular moment." There was a pause. Then Miss Lyle's voice, quieter, and carrying something that was not quite resentment but very near its border. "I have said nothing to anyone, Helena. I do not intend to. I am only saying that it is not comfortable." "No," said Mrs. Durrant. The word held a curious complexity of acknowledgement. It is not comfortable, but discomfort is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes it is simply the cost of a situation. Another silence followed, then the click of the orchard gate latch. "He would have spoken at the committee," said Miss Lyle, and there was in her voice the level firmness of someone stating a fact already accepted but not yet emotionally laid aside. "He told me so himself that morning. He said there were aspects of the committee's recent conduct that required public address." "Yes," said Mrs. Durrant, "I know. And you did not know what he meant, specifically." "I had some idea." Miss Marple's hands continued moving among the rose stems, but her mind sharpened. "He was not always consistent," Mrs. Durrant went on, "in what he decided required correction. His attention moved about." "He was very particular about the accounts," said Miss Lyle more quietly still. "I know because he mentioned it directly to me. He said the expenditure on the hall renovation had not been properly detailed in the minutes, and that he intended to say so." The silence that followed was different from the others. Miss Marple continued pruning with every appearance of natural absorption. At last Mrs. Durrant spoke again, and her voice had acquired the careful steadiness of a person reassembling composure that has been momentarily disturbed. "The accounts are correct. There was nothing irregular in the renovation expenditure. It was recorded in summary because the committee voted to record it so, and Mr. Avery was present at that vote." She paused. If he had changed his mind about the adequacy of the record, he was perfectly at liberty to say so at the next meeting. "I should have had the detailed figures available within the hour." "I'm sure you would," said Miss Lyle. The words were entirely civil. They also carried, Miss Marple thought, more weight than civility alone accounted for. After that, the conversation moved into the safe territory that indicates an end rather than a resolution. Remarks about the weather improving, about whether all the hall chairs had been returned, about practical matters too bland to contain danger. Then footsteps retreated in opposite directions, and the lane sank back into the ordinary silence of a bright autumn morning. Miss Marple sat back on her heels and regarded the rose bed as though considering whether she had pruned sufficiently. In reality, she was thinking about accounts. She was thinking about renovation expenditure entered in summary rather than detail, about a man of fixed standards who had once consented to such a record and later concluded that it was inadequate, about what he might have seen, on reviewing it more closely, that caused him to alter his view, and about what effect a public objection from Mr. Avery might have had on a particular person's standing and reputation. She was thinking too about the relationship between the two women beyond the wall. One knew more than she wished to say and managed that knowledge with great discipline. The other suspected enough to feel the pressure of silence becoming difficult to sustain. Miss Marple had known a similar arrangement once between two sisters in the village, one who carried the facts and one who carried the anxiety. It had ended as such arrangements often do when the anxiety became heavier than the silence could support. She did not, however, mistake shape for certainty. What she had heard above the orchard wall was not proof. It was only pattern, useful, suggestive, increasingly coherent pattern, but not yet proof. She rose, collected her tools, and stood for a moment in the bright cold air. The garden smelled of damp earth, and the faint sweetness of the last apple still hanging in the farthest corner of the orchard. Beyond the wall the lane remained quiet. She had one further call to make that afternoon. She would make it after luncheon, when people were settled and a little less guarded. It was, she had always found, the most productive time of day for conversations requiring delicacy and perseverance. She went indoors to wash her hands and consider, very carefully indeed, how best to approach a woman who had spent years managing the impressions of those around her, and who was, in Miss Marple's estimation, considerably more frightened than she appeared. Chapter 7. An Acorn-Shaped Brooch. The afternoon of the 29th possessed that rare October clarity, which seems less like weather than a temporary act of grace. The sky, above St. Mary Mead, was a lucid, washed blue. The air held the sharp, metallic edge of coming evening, and the village, its annual exertions now completed, had settled into the curious hush that follows any communal effort, once the last chair has been stacked and the last teacup dried. It was not idleness exactly. It was pause. Miss Marple set out at 2 o'clock with no appearance of intention beyond that of an elderly lady taking the air, which was often the most effective appearance to cultivate. She'd spent an hour after luncheon in quiet thought, and the conclusion to which she had come, provisional but sufficiently clear to govern the next step, was that she must see Helena Durrant again, and under conditions less formal than those of a drawing-room call. One learns more, Miss Marple had always found, from people in the midst of ordinary occupation than from people prepared for conversation. As it happened, she did not need to call at the house. Mrs. Durrant was in her front garden, cutting back the last tired stems of summer with a pair of secateurs. She worked with the same concentrated competence she brought to all tasks, whether social or practical, and there was about her movements that quality of exact economy which suggests not coldness, but discipline long practiced until it has become a second nature. She wore a dark coat over a wool dress, and at her lapel, catching the pale autumn light in brief deliberate flashes, was a brooch shaped like an acorn. Miss Marple had seen it before. Indeed, she had seen it several times over the years without consciously storing it away. It was a pretty thing, gold, or perhaps only cleverly plated, its cap textured to imitate the roughness of a real acorn shell, and Mrs. Durrant wore it with the unconsidered ease of an object that had long ago passed from adornment into habit. Yet Miss Marple had noticed it at the exhibition opening, and now again in the garden, and there are certain objects which, by appearing twice within a short compass, oblige the observant mind to revise their importance. "Miss Marple," said Mrs. Durrant, looking up with composed pleasantness. It was not warmth exactly, but a perfectly judged civility. Helena Durrant had clearly concluded long ago that pleasantness was the most efficient available policy in nearly all human encounters. "What a fine afternoon," said Miss Marple, pausing at the gate with the mild leisure of a woman who has simply happened by. "And your garden is very well kept, even now. Mine begins to look rather fatigued by the end of October. I do not think I have your gift for order." "It is more habit than gift," said Mrs. Durrant, snipping a stem with a neatness that suggested she had chosen the precise point of division before the blade ever closed. "One does the thing that is required at the moment it is required, and the garden more or less keeps itself in hand." She straightened, the brooch catching light again. "Do come in, if you would care to sit for a little. I can make tea." Miss Marple accepted with quiet readiness. They sat in the garden rather than indoors, at Helena Durrant's suggestion. The afternoon, she said, was still mild enough, and the light too good to waste. She brought out a tray with a small pot and 2 cups and arranged it on the iron table near the back door, with the easy grace of someone to whom tea was neither ceremony nor burden, but simply one more practical kindness to be administered properly. The acorn brooch was close now. Miss Marple observed it with the kind of pleasant attention she might have given to any agreeable piece of jewellery, which was, she knew, the least alarming way to observe anything. "What a charming brooch," she said after the tea had been poured, and a comfortable little silence had formed between them. Mrs. Durrant's hand went up, almost involuntarily, to the lapel. "Thank you," she said. "It was a gift." She paused. Not from reluctance, Miss Marple thought, but from that habit of measured speech which makes a person decide, even in harmless matters, how much of a thing shall be said. Then she went on in an even tone. "From Mr. Avery, some years ago, after the hall renovation, he said it was in recognition of the work the committee had done, and of the chairmanship specifically, though in practice it was rather more than that." "More than recognition of committee work, you mean?" Mrs. Durrant rested her cup in its saucer and looked out over the narrow beds. The renovation was a more complicated undertaking than it appeared from outside. There was a question of funding at one point. The budget had been drawn on the assumption of a county grant, and the grant was reduced at the last moment, quite significantly. It became necessary to manage the shortfall, and the management of it was not always straightforward in presentation. Miss Marple said nothing. She had long considered silence one of the most generous forms of encouragement. Mr. Avery understood the situation, Mrs. Durrant continued. He was on the committee. He knew the figures that could properly be presented to the general membership, and the figures that existed in full, and he approved the distinction at the time. Indeed, he was the one who suggested that a summary record would be sufficient. She turned then and met Miss Marple's eyes with an expression that was both candid and carefully contained. An impressive combination. The brooch was, I think, his way of acknowledging that I had managed a difficult business well, and of acknowledging, without saying it directly, that we had a shared understanding of how it had been managed. "An understanding based on mutual knowledge," said Miss Marple gently. "Yes," said Mrs. Durrant, and the single word was spoken with delicate exactness. "Not benefit. That suggests something consciously sought. Knowledge merely means one is aware of the same facts. The hall was properly completed. The village has benefited from it. The committee managed a difficult situation without troubling the membership with details that would only have caused anxiety and achieved nothing useful." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully, as though following an interesting argument rather than appraising its moral architecture. "And then he changed his mind," she said. The secateurs lay on the table beside the tray. Mrs. Durrant looked at them briefly before answering. He had been unwell since the spring. Illness, in certain temperaments, produces a retrospective severity. One looks back at what one has done and applies a harsher standard than the one by which it was originally done. Last summer he began speaking to me privately of the renovation accounts. He said he had looked at them again and found the summary insufficient. He used the word irregularity. She spoke the last word with such fine precision that it seemed to carry a weight far beyond its dictionary meaning. "Though the irregularity, if there was one, had been his own suggestion," said Miss Marple, "in substance, yes." Mrs. Durrant's inflection was the inflection of a person telling the truth, while also knowing perfectly well that truth, if detached from context, may give an entirely false impression of a situation. The figures as they stand are what they are. I cannot alter them, nor would I wish to, but their interpretation depends entirely upon understanding what happened and why, and who was party to it. Without that understanding, they tell a misleading story. She set down her cup with remarkable steadiness. He had begun to forget what he himself had approved, she said quietly. Or perhaps not forget. Perhaps he had simply decided in the severity of illness that his approval had been mistaken. Either way, He intended to speak at the November meeting. He told me so directly the morning before he died. He said he had a duty to the membership. Her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. He was always very clear about his duties. Yes, said Miss Marple, he was. They sat for a little while in the stillness of the garden. A blackbird called from the hedge with the authoritative self-importance of creatures who regard themselves as permanent proprietors of the earth. The acorn brooch flashed in small bright intervals as Helena Durrant breathed. Miss Marple thought then of gratitude and obligation, and of how often the two become entangled until neither can be cleanly separated from the other. Mr. Avery's support in the difficult years, the hall renovation, the summary accounts, the brooch as a wordless acknowledgement of shared knowledge. Gratitude, she had long observed, possesses a natural lifespan. Extended beyond it by dependence or by secrecy, it slowly curdles into something much harder to bear. She thought of the sedative, mild, soluble, easily obtained. She thought of the flask left on the kitchen dresser. She thought of a woman of great discipline and great self-command, facing the possible public dismantling of a careful structure she had built with enormous effort, by the very man whose advice had first helped her build it. No, Helena Durrant could not have known with certainty how an already weakened heart would respond. She might, Miss Marple reflected, have intended only drowsiness, a slowing, a softening of the afternoon, the blunting of certainty before a committee meeting, the postponement of some humiliating reckoning that had come to seem unbearable. A tablet dissolved quietly into diluted sherry, an old man growing slower beneath pale autumn light, a difficult confrontation deferred. She might have intended only that. Whether she had allowed herself to think fully about what else she might be setting in motion was another matter altogether. Miss Marple was not yet prepared to answer it, and she thought it very important to approach such questions with the greatest care, and with the compassion due to all human beings who, under the accumulated pressure of circumstance, have arrived at a moment they may never have believed themselves capable of reaching. At last she set down her cup, thanked Mrs. Durrant warmly for the tea, and rose with the comfortable ease of a neighbour whose half-hour had been pleasantly spent. Mrs. Durrant accompanied her to the gate with the same composed courtesy she had shown throughout. As Miss Marple reached the corner of the path, she glanced back once. Helena Durrant was still standing there, and the expression on her face could not be reduced to any single readable feeling. The acorn brooch caught the light one final time, small, gold, and very still, before the gate closed softly between them. Miss Marple walked home through the lucid October afternoon, thinking with the thoroughness the matter deserved, and finding that the shape of what she understood had grown at once clearer and sadder. Chapter 8. Minutes. Written in a careful hand. The committee minutes were kept in a green ledger of the kind that had been used for such purposes since the exhibition's founding, a fact Miss Marple had known in the general way one knows where the hymn books are stored, or who keeps the spare key to the parish side door, without ever having had reason to trouble over it. The ledger resided between meetings in a locked wooden cabinet at the rear of the parish hall vestibule. The key was held by the committee secretary, Mr. Gifford, a retired postal clerk of methodical habits, and, by general village agreement, exceptional penmanship. He had occupied the position for 9 years, and showed no sign whatever of wishing to surrender it, which suited the committee extremely well, and himself even better. Miss Marple had always thought that voluntary arrangements are safest when all parties derive from them exactly the kind of satisfaction they prefer. She had, not until now, given the minutes any special thought. But the conversation in Helena Durrant's garden, the careful account of the renovation, the summary record voted into place, Mr. Avery's original approval and subsequent reversal, had suggested that the ledger might repay inspection, not because she expected it to contain formal proof of wrongdoing, it almost certainly would not, but because such records, as Helena herself had in effect admitted, depend for their meaning upon the understanding brought to them by the reader, and Miss Marple believed she now possessed rather more of the relevant understanding than most. She called upon Mr. Gifford on the morning of Saturday the 30th at his cottage behind the post office. He received her in his small sitting room with the pleased surprise of a man who rarely had visitors, and was obliged, upon receiving one, to discover that he had perhaps missed company more than he had supposed. He was a precise little man of 70, and the occupational habits of his former life still clung to him. He handled papers with that slight reverence peculiar to men who have spent decades sorting, stamping, filing, and delivering them. One felt that documents, in Mr. Gifford's estimation, possessed a kind of moral dignity independent of their content. Miss Marple explained that she would very much like to look over the committee records for the past 3 years, if he would be so kind. She gave, as her reason, a general curiosity about the exhibition's development and a particular interest in the hall renovation, about which she had always meant to inquire more properly. Mr. Gifford received this with gratification. The ledger was produced with promptness, suggesting it had not been far from hand. He made tea while she examined it, which was considerate, and then left her largely to herself, which was more considerate still. Miss Marple turned the pages with the unhurried deliberation of one reading not simply for information, but for pattern. The minutes were, as reported, written in a hand of considerable distinction. Mr. Gifford formed his letters with the care of a man who had copied addresses in ink for 30 years, and regarded illegibility as a kind of moral slackness. Each entry was dated, signed by both secretary and chair, and cross-referenced where necessary to summaries appended at the rear. She found the renovation entries without difficulty. They occupied 5 meetings across 8 months, and the progression of the language across those meetings was itself instructive. The first entry, from February of the previous year, was expansive. The renovation was described in full, its scope and estimated cost carefully detailed across nearly 2 pages. The county grant was noted as the principal source of funding, and the committee's approval recorded unanimously. Miss Marple observed that Mr. Avery's name appeared twice in this entry, once as proposing the renovation's formal adoption, and once as endorsing the grant application. The second and third entries traced the progress of the work in measured terms. The reduction in the grant was mentioned, but only briefly. One line in the third meeting's record stating that a revised funding arrangement had been agreed, with details appended. Miss Marple turned to the appendix. There she found a summary figure, properly signed, with a note that detailed receipts were held by the committee chair. The note was initialed in a small authoritative script instantly recognisable in St. Mary Mead's civic life. L.A. Lawrence Avery. Miss Marple sat for a moment with that. The tea beside her had begun to cool. The fourth entry recorded the renovation's completion, and the committee's satisfaction with the result. The fifth and final renovation entry, from the following October, noted a vote of thanks to Mrs. Durrant for her management of the project, proposed by Mr. Avery and seconded without dissent. Miss Marple read those pages twice. At the foot of each entry, Helena Durrant's signature appeared as chair, remarkably consistent in form, each letter shaped with equal pressure and equal control. One does not, Miss Marple thought, acquire a hand like that without long practice in resisting the impulse to hurry, and the resistance of such impulses in writing often corresponds to the resistance of them elsewhere, in speech, in judgment, in conduct. She had known several people of that disposition over the years. The composure in them was always real. It was not a mere surface laid over disorder. It was something built by discipline, maintained by will, and dependent upon the preservation of whatever conditions had made such discipline necessary. When those conditions altered, when the threat became direct enough, the composure did not quite break. It adapted. It selected the minimum necessary action, and returned afterwards to calm with such smoothness that anyone not watching closely might miss the moment of disturbance altogether. She was still thinking along those lines when Mr. Gifford came back with a fresh pot of tea, and the hopeful expression of a man who would dearly like to know what had been discovered, but is too well trained in discretion to ask outright. "I noticed," said Miss Marple conversationally, "that Mr. Avery initialed the financial summary for the renovation himself. He took a very active interest in the accounts, did he not?" Mr. Gifford sat opposite her with the contained eagerness of a man at last invited into his own subject. "He did indeed. Very active. He and Mrs. Durrant worked closely together on the renovation. There were aspects of it, I think, that they handled largely between themselves rather than bringing every small detail to the full committee, which is reasonable enough in a project of that size and urgency." He paused, then added with delicate care, "Mr. Avery's involvement did ensure efficiency. He was not a man who believed committees were improved by excessive consultation." "No," said Miss Marple, "he was not." Mr. Gifford poured the tea with precision. "I did notice," he continued, "that about 2 months ago he asked me to let him review the renovation entries. He said he wished to check some figures. I gave him the ledger for an afternoon, and he returned it without comment." He lowered the pot. "But I had the impression that he had found something he wanted to think about. He seemed concentrated when he brought it back. The way a man looks when he has confirmed something he is not altogether pleased to have confirmed." Miss Marple found that very interesting indeed. "And he said nothing specific. Nothing. Only that the records were admirably kept, which I appreciated." Mr. Gifford glanced down at his cup. "One notices things in this sort of role," he said after a moment, "and is not always certain what ought to be done with them." Miss Marple gave him a look of sincere understanding. "To notice carefully and to keep an accurate record is already a very considerable service," she said. "Often the meaning of things is only visible some time after they are written down." Mr. Gifford appeared comforted by that, though he also seemed to feel there was an implication just beyond his reach. Being a man who preferred facts to implications, he did not pursue it. Miss Marple returned the ledger with genuine thanks, declined a biscuit, and made her way home through the bright October morning. By then the accumulated picture in her mind was very nearly complete. She knew, or believed she knew, with the confidence that comes from long practice in assembling small truths into a larger one, what had happened. She knew who had done it, and she believed she understood why, which in some respects was the more important knowledge. She knew too that what had been done had not been conceived in malice, and she knew that this altered nothing in its consequence. Intent and consequence, she reflected, may inhabit the same act without requiring from the world exactly the same response. That was always where the matter became most difficult. Facts may be gathered, arranged, and interpreted, but what one ought to do with them belongs to another order of judgment entirely. She walked past the elm copse without pausing. The old stone bench stood empty, as it had since the 24th, and the leaves around it had thickened until the grass beneath was almost fully hidden. The season was carrying on its own quiet work of covering. She thought of Helena Durrant in her garden with the secateurs in her hand. She thought of the ledger entries, the summaries, the initials, the careful architecture of a situation built by two people and now threatening, through the failing certainty of one of them, to collapse upon the other. She thought of Philip Durrant's haggard face in the drawing-room, and of the burden he had been, carrying in silence. A good many people in villages, Miss Marple thought, carry silences of this sort for remarkably long periods, sustained by habit, by routine, and by the very human gift of not looking too directly at what most alarms them. There was nothing extraordinary in that. It was in fact extremely ordinary. At her gate she stopped for a moment and looked at her own garden, which had the honest, somewhat depleted look of late October, not yet winter, no longer summer, with work still left before the first hard frost. There was indeed work still to do, and she would do it. But first she meant to take a walk in the yew garden behind the church, where she had occasionally found, on other occasions requiring judgment, that the particular stillness beneath the dark boughs was favourable to the final settling of a considered mind. She went inside, put on a warmer coat, and prepared to go. Chapter 9. A Confession by the Yew Walk. The Yew Walk ran along the northern boundary of The churchyard, a corridor of dark-clipped hedges some 30 yards in length, opening at its far end onto a small square of gravel, flanked by 2 stone benches. One could sit there in the particular silence old yews produce, a silence not merely made by the absence of sound, but by something denser and more deliberate, as though the thick growth absorbed the world's ordinary noise and returned in its place something older, quieter, and more considered. Miss Marple had walked there many times over the years in varying states of mind, and had always found it favourable to the sort of thinking that required the world to stand a little farther off than usual. She did not find it empty. Helena's Durrant was seated on the nearer of the 2 benches, her coat buttoned to the throat, her gloved hands resting upon her knees, her face turned toward the far end of the walk with such settled stillness that she might almost have been part of the design itself, another element of gravel, stone, yew, and late October composure placed there by intention rather than accident. She looked up when she heard Miss Marple's footsteps. The expression that crossed her face was not surprise exactly. It was the look of a person who has been waiting without fully admitting that she is waiting, and who discovers when the expected thing finally arrives that relief comes with it. "Miss Marple," she said. "Mrs. Durrant." Miss Marple took the second bench with the comfortable deliberateness of someone who has at last arrived at a destination toward which she has, in one way or another, been walking for several days. "What a good thought to come here," she said mildly. "Yes," said Helena Durrant. "I think I had the same impulse." For a moment they sat in silence, enclosed not only by the yews but by their mutual understanding of why they were both there. Neither yet named it. Somewhere in the distance a wood-pigeon called with its usual untroubled gravity. Above the dark, green corridor the sky was pale and thin, already leaning toward the shortened afternoon. At length Mrs. Durrant said, "You have been looking at things very carefully." It was not an accusation. It was a statement, offered with the candour of a woman who has reached the point at which the maintenance of surfaces no longer seems worth its considerable cost. "I have," said Miss Marple. "The accounts," said Mrs. Durrant. "And the flask, and other things, I imagine." "Yes." Helena looked down at her gloves. "I have known since the day after he died that someone would look carefully," she said. "And I think I've been waiting for the looking to be completed." "It is not a comfortable kind of waiting," said Miss Marple. "No." Mrs. Durrant lifted her eyes and looked toward the opening of the walk where the hedge gave on to the older part of the churchyard and the leaning stones of long-settled dead. "I have slept very badly," she said. "Philip knows. Something is wrong, though not specifically what. He has been very kind, which in some ways makes it worse." Miss Marple said nothing. She had found that when people had finally reached the point of truth, interruption was a kind of cruelty. "I dissolved a tablet into the flask," said Mrs. Durrant. Her voice was level, not the levelness of something practised and repeated, but the levelness of a woman who has been conducting the same inward conversation for 8 days, and is now, at last, allowing it to become audible. "One tablet. The preparation I use for sleeplessness. I have kept it by me for 2 years, since that winter when Philip was in London, and the house was very quiet and the nights rather long." She paused. "I thought it would make him drowsy. I thought he would walk to the copse, sit in the afternoon sun, grow sleepy, and return home without the sharpness or alertness required to do what he had said he intended to do." Her hands tightened very slightly, within the gloves. "It sounds, when I say it aloud, very small." "It was very small," said Miss Marple gently. "That is, I think, rather the tragedy of it." Helena gave a brief, almost soundless breath, which might have become a laugh in easier circumstances, and instead became nothing at all. "He was going to speak at the November meeting," she said. "He told me so directly. He had reviewed the accounts and formed the view that the summary record was, as he put it, incomplete. He had forgotten, or persuaded himself to forget, that the summary record had been his own suggestion. He intended to say before the committee that there were irregularities in the renovation accounts which required examination." She turned her head, and for the first time there was something in her voice other than control. There were no irregularities. There was a shortfall which had been managed as well as it could be managed in the circumstances, and every decision taken had been known to him at the time it was taken. But without his own recollection to confirm it, the account of events would have been mine alone, and I was not certain, given the way he was speaking, that my account would have been found sufficient. Miss Marple regarded her with the utmost care. Helena Durrant was not minimising what she had done, nor was she dramatising it. She was describing it with the precision of a woman long accustomed to managing difficult facts, and now unwilling, at least in this one place, to distort them by either self-pity or false innocence. "You did not consider," said Miss Marple quietly, "what the sedative might do to a heart already fragile." The words entered the stillness without violence. Mrs. Durrant received them with the look of someone who has asked herself the same question through 8 successive nights, and found no arrangement of words that makes it easier. "I told myself I did not know how bad his condition was," she said, and now, at last, there was pain in her voice. Not hysteria, not even weeping, but the first unmistakable break in the disciplined surface. Dr. Haydock had spoken to him privately. One heard that he had been unwell, that he was taking things more quietly, but one did not know the particulars. She stopped. "I told myself that. I tell myself that now, and part of me believes it. But part of me knows that when one very much wishes not to consider a thing, the refusal to consider it is not quite the same as ignorance." The wood-pigeon called again, farther away. "I did not intend his death," she said. "I say that not as a defence, but because it is true. I intended an afternoon's drowsiness. I intended the postponement of an uncomfortable reckoning. I did not intend, I could not have intended what followed. At the moment I did it, I did not think I was setting anything irrevocable in motion." "No," said Miss Marple. Her voice held neither absolution nor condemnation, only plain acknowledgment. "I believe that is true." Helena turned and looked at her directly then, and there was in her expression something that came very near gratitude, though gratitude seemed almost an absurd word in such a setting. After a little while, Miss Marple spoke again. "I have thought a great deal," she said, "about what one does with the knowledge one assembles. It is not always a simple matter. The law proceeds by certainty, and certainty is not always available. Dr. Haydock cannot say with certainty that the sedative caused the failure of the heart. He can only say that it cannot be ruled out. Mr. Avery's heart, by his own doctor's view, was capable of failing at any time." She folded her hands in her lap before continuing. "What the law would make of it, I cannot say. What one makes of it oneself is another matter. I think you have done something which you did not intend to be as grave as it proved, and I think you know this more fully than many people ever know the consequences of their own actions. That is not nothing." Mrs. Durrant listened with the full attention of a person to whom every word matters. "I think also," Miss Marple went on, "that there are debts incurred by actions of this kind which are not always settled by formal process, but rather slowly and with considerable discomfort by the conduct of the life that follows." She said it without sentimentality, without any suggestion that such settlement would be easy, swift, or complete. Helena was silent for a long time. At last she said, "I shall resign the chairmanship after this season. I had already thought of it." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I rather thought you might. Philip's proposals for the exhibition, the new categories, the provision for younger entrants, the revised judging, those are good ideas. They ought to go forward." "They are very good ideas," said Miss Marple. "He is more capable than Mr. Avery ever liked to admit." The light had altered almost imperceptibly while they spoke. The Yew Walk was a degree darker now, the stone bench cold beneath Miss Marple's coat. They rose together, which seemed the most natural thing in the world, and walked slowly back along the corridor of clipped yew toward the churchyard gate. Neither had any need to repeat what had already been said. At the gate, Helena paused and looked back once toward the farther bench. "Humiliation," she said, almost to herself. It was not quite a question, not quite a conclusion either. is often feared more than consequence, said Miss Marple very quietly. Yes, said Mrs. Durrant. That is, I think, rather the centre of it. Then she turned, met Miss Marple's eyes steadily, and said, Thank you for the manner in which you have done this. Miss Marple inclined her head. They went out through the gate in separate directions into the cooling October light, each carrying what she carried. Chapter 10. Lanterns lining the gravel path. November arrived in St. Mary Mead with the measured inevitability of a guest long expected, whose appearance, when it finally comes, is neither surprising nor unwelcome, only final. The elms along the green had surrendered the last of their colour. The paths were damp most mornings. Smoke rose from chimneys with the purposeful steadiness of a village settling itself for the dark months ahead, drawing curtains earlier each evening and discovering in fires lit and kettles boiled the particular domestic comfort that October's milder weather had not yet made entirely necessary. The closing evening of the harvest exhibition, delayed by a day because of the weather, fell on a Friday in the first week of November. It was, like most closing occasions, smaller and quieter than the opening. Those who came had some actual investment in the exhibition's end, rather than merely its ceremony. The hall was warmly lit from within, and along the gravel path from gate to door someone had set simple paper lanterns at even intervals, so that the approach possessed a gentle festive quality more affecting, Miss Marple thought, than the more elaborate arrangements of the opening morning. It had clearly been done with care and without the least wish to impress, which is often the more moving thing. Miss Marple came with Mrs. Bantry, who had elected to attend on the excellent principle that closing ceremonies are generally more honest than openings, people having by then formed their actual opinions instead of the opinions they originally intended to form. "I notice Helena Durrant is not presiding," said Mrs. Bantry as they entered the hall. "Mrs. Hargreaves is doing the honours," said Miss Marple. This was true. Mrs. Hargreaves, a capable committee member with a gift for proceeding without fuss, had been asked at short notice to take the chair. Mrs. Durrant had sent word that she was indisposed. The explanation had been accepted with no particular display of surprise, and as far as Miss Marple could determine, with no especially dangerous speculation either. The evening unfolded with the softened warmth of a gathering that has shed its official character and settled into something more genuinely social. The remaining exhibits were admired with an enthusiasm no longer sharpened by rivalry. Tea was taken in generous quantities. Thomas Bell circulated with a plate of shortbread that appeared from some mysterious source and disappeared with remarkable speed, which said all that needed to be said about its merit. Miss Marple found herself beside him near the rear of the hall. "A very good exhibition on the whole," she observed. "Better than some," said Thomas Bell, with the equanimity of a man who had seen enough of them to speak from evidence rather than enthusiasm. He offered her the shortbread, and she accepted a piece. "Mrs. Hargreaves does it quietly," he said. "No flourish, but it gets done." "That is very often the best kind of management," said Miss Marple. Thomas regarded her with that mild, deliberate look which she had come to recognise as the prelude to one of his more carefully considered remarks. "I heard Mrs. Durrant is stepping back after this season." "So I understand." "It will be a change," he said without judgment. "She's run it smoothly for a long time." He paused. "Things run smoothly until they don't. Then you find out what they were made of." He seemed to consider something further and then, having evidently decided that he had thought long enough, continued. "I was in the copse that afternoon, Miss Marple, earlier than when I found him. I'd been clearing dead wood near the far edge and came round by the bench. He was already there, just settling himself down." Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "He looked peaceful," Thomas said. "More peaceful than I'd seen him in some time." There was a short pause. "He spoke to me, said, 'Good afternoon, Belle,' the way he always did, very particular, and then he said, 'I think it may be a good winter after all,' which struck me as a thing to say at the end of October." He glanced down at the shortbread plate. "Then he closed his eyes when I moved on. I thought nothing of it at the time. He often liked to sit in the quiet." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "he did." She moved away a few moments later, carrying not only the shortbread but the image Thomas had given her. An old man settled upon his accustomed bench in the pale autumn light, believing himself to have made a decision, knowing nothing of what had already been introduced into that quiet afternoon. There was sadness in the image, certainly, but there was something else close beside it. Not comfort exactly, yet not wholly distant from comfort either. He had not been frightened. He had not known. He had slipped from the ordinary world while sitting in elm light and thinking of winter. She was still turning this over in her mind when Philip Durrant appeared at her elbow. "Miss Marple," he said, "I wondered whether I might speak to you." "Of course." He looked better than he had days earlier, not free of strain, such things do not vanish overnight, but steadier. The drawn expression had softened into something more manageable, the difference between a tension merely endured and one at last acknowledged. He glanced toward the lanterns visible through the window, small amber shapes against the dark. "Helena told me 2 evenings ago," he said, "not, I think, every inward particular, but the essential thing, about the tablet in the flask, about what she intended and what resulted. She told me very clearly, very completely, without trying to diminish it." He hesitated. "I have found that harder to bear than I expected," he said, "and easier in some respects, both at once." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "both things can be true." He looked at his hands briefly. "I wanted to ask what you intend to do with what you know, not from self-interest only, or not primarily. I ask because I think Helena has already, in her own fashion, begun to do what must be done. She is stepping away from the chairmanship. She has not slept. I do not think she will sleep easily for some time." He stopped, then began again more plainly. "Is there to be any official consequence?" Miss Marple was quiet for a little while before answering. She had considered the question with great care. What was certain and what was not? What a formal process could establish and what it could not? What it would serve and what it might merely enact? She had considered Dr. Haydock's positions genuinely ambiguous, the law's appetite for certainty, which in this case was unavailable, Helena's act, and the grave distance between intention and result. At last she said with measured exactness, "There are circumstances in which formal consequences are not the only consequences available, and in which their application would not necessarily produce justice as distinct from process." Philip said nothing. "Dr. Haydock cannot establish with certainty that the sedative caused the death," she continued. "Mrs. Durrant did not intend the death that occurred. Those are not comfortable facts, and they do not make the act acceptable, but they do affect what can properly be said to be required." She looked at him steadily. "What is required, I think, is that she live with a complete understanding of what she has done. From what you tell me, she has already begun to do so." The expression on Philip Durrant's face was, at root, relief, but not only relief. There was sorrow in it also, and something like gratitude, and altogether it made him more sympathetic than Miss Marple had originally found him. After a moment she said, "Your proposals for the exhibition, the expanded categories, the younger entrants, the revised structure, I hope you will press on with them." He looked slightly startled by the turn. "I intend to." "Good," said Miss Marple. "The village will benefit, and I think the work will benefit you, which is equally important." He gave her a look that suggested he was revising in real time some estimate he had formed of her without realizing he had formed it. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Marple," he said. "I am a very ordinary woman," said Miss Marple comfortably, "who has paid attention for a long time. It is astonishing what attention accumulates." He smiled then, properly smiled, perhaps for the first time since she had seen him back from London, and moved away toward the tea urn. Miss Marple remained a little longer, finishing her shortbread and watching the hall with the quiet pleasure she always took in people gathered together over the ordinary business of life, talking, adjusting, disagreeing, making allowances, reconciling themselves to things, and by these small repeated acts keeping communities coherent and human beings on the whole functioning. At last she put on her coat, said her good nights, and stepped out into the November dark. The lanterns were still lit along the gravel path, their small steady light falling over wet stones and scattered leaves. She walked between them slowly, then crossed the green where the elm stood bare against the sky, and the stone bench at the edge of the copse remained a pale shape in the darkness, holding its silence as it always had. At her gate she paused and looked back once more at the diminishing line of lanterns. She thought of something she had once said long ago, that the most instructive thing about people is not merely what they do, but why they do it, and that the why, once properly understood, is usually far more ordinary than the event itself first suggests: fear of humiliation. The wish to preserve what one has built. A terribly precise miscalculation in a single moment of strain. Ordinary things. She went inside, put the kettle on, and settled herself in her accustomed chair by the fire. Outside, St. Mary Mead folded itself into November quiet, altered just slightly from what it had been a fortnight earlier, though no one, if directly asked, would have been able to say precisely how. The leaves continued their slow accumulation over the green. The elm copse stood dark and patient. The village resumed its rhythms as villages always do, carrying forward its knowledge of itself, partial, human, imperfect, into whatever season came next. The kettle began to sing. Miss Marple rose to attend to it, and in that moment, as in so many others, the life of the village went quietly on.